Welcome Internet to Psychologist Casual Review, and today I wanted to review a short article by Harry Guntrip, which is titled My Experience of Analysis with Fairbairn and Winnicott. So it's an article that's very interesting for many reasons. The first and foremost is that it's the account of psychoanalysis with two unmatched clinicians, which are Fairbairn and Winnicott. So it's going to be interesting. But it's also very interesting because in this article, Guntrip is very, very genuine with the reader. He does talk about past traumas. He does talk about a lot of things that occurred during his development, his childhood, and even early childhood, and very traumatic things that I will go into as we go forward with this review. But he holds nothing back. And in a way, I felt that it was very interesting because it's the coming together of both Harry Guntrip as a patient, Harry Guntrip as a clinician himself, and Harry Guntrip as a human being. And both of those three facets come together and form a whole that's really wholesome. And I felt that the text was very touching in a lot of ways. Perhaps it's also because there's a personal aspect to it, which is kind of rare in psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis tend to be very distant, very private. But here, Harry Guntrip kind of breaks the rules by being so overtly honest and genuine and just sharing what he had experienced as a patient. And so the meat of the text is basically Harry starts, as often in his text, by a theoretical element, i.e. his big question is, can an analysis be considered finished at some point? And he does tend to eject the question really quickly, but the question remains very interesting because that's how he's gonna start his essay. And he's going to basically try and shift the perspective by saying this is not important, this is not the fundamentals. What is fundamental is the insight that one gains through analysis. And he's going to start by explaining a bit of his background. That basically both of those analysts, Winnicott and Fairbairn, were very good and helped him a lot, but they didn't really give him the insights that allowed him to directly have retour du refoulé, you'd say in French, which I think in English would be translated as basically a return of the repressed, meaning that a memory was unlocked where it was repressed. And he basically states that that memory that came back was the death of his brother. Well, he was consciously aware that there was the death of his brother Percy. He never really emotionally lived the experience. And it's only after analysis that the experience really came back on an emotional level for him in a dream, in which he saw the dead body of Percy on his mother's lap, and basically the mother had no face, no breasts and no arms, meaning that she was cold, perhaps desperate also. And that's something he talks about in the article, how basically it's also post-analysis, beyond analysis, that some things resolve themselves. Because there was analysis, it's not like completely separate, it's a continuation, but he does state that basically one never really ends to work on oneself, and I do believe that it's never ended, it's never a shut and closed case, it's always ongoing. Even in his 70s, Guntrip had new insights about his early childhood, which is something I personally find wonderful because I think it's genuinely true. One never stops developing, even in old age. And basically, to come back to the article, he does state that he started with Fairbairn because he had read the texts on the schizoid development, and Fairbairn's model felt really something he could connect to. So he went and sought Fairbairn in Edinburgh for analysis. And basically, it was a very mixed bag from what I understand, because basically, Fairbairn could be very cold, very interpretive, and very intellectualizing during the sessions. Like, he would really go for the ego defenses. He would try and really be as thorough intellectually as possible, even though it might not have helped the therapeutic alliance or transference he was intellectually precise within the ego defenses, meaning he said, you feel this because I represent your mother that never cared for you. He would go for those like pinpointing, let's say, qualitative but very complicated and hard for the patient to receive interpretations. And Guntrip was basically felt that was complicated, as that reactivated for him his image of his bad mother, because Guntrip also states that he had a very bad relationship with his mother, as his mother never wanted to have children, that she had to upbring him, but she never felt really anything for him. And basically she felt at least that she was not really meant to be a mother, and that she wanted to be a businesswoman. So from the get-go, Guntrip says that basically his mother never had a desire for having children, perhaps because she herself was put very early into the role of a substitute mother for all her brothers and sisters, being the eldest child of a big family. So basically she was an abusive woman who had abused Guntrip both before and after the death of his younger brother, because that's one of the big elements of Guntrip in this text, is the death of his brother Percy when he was about 3.5 years old, and how he remembers the death of Percy and how he held Percy in his arms, thinking to himself, if I ever let go of Percy, I'll never see him again, and how the mother pushed him out of the room, keeping Percy in her arms. And basically it's a very touching story of how basically Guntrip was never really able to establish a relationship with his own mother, and how he explains that Fairbairn at moments in the transference represented that unavailable mother, that distant and cold mother. But at other times, for example, mainly when they were talking fairy, which is interesting because we don't necessarily do it like this these days, but there was basically the analysis part where the goal was interpretation and trying to get to the core, and a more intellectual side in which they would discuss fairy, Fairbairn and him. And during those moments of discussing fairy, he felt that Fairbairn was like the warm father, the loving father that he had, because the father of Guntrip was not a cold man at all. He was a loving, caring man who was basically counterbalanced to his mother, and a good identification for Guntrip, which is interesting because Guntrip became a minister and his father was a minister, so there was something good, at least in that relationship, going on. And he felt that Fairbairn, in those moments of intellectual sharing, was a good enough father to invent a new terminology, or at least mimic one. And what was very interesting, and I felt very great in this article, is that he doesn't idealize nor Fairbairn nor Winnicott. He does say that they missed sins, that they were not necessarily always on point. And he does say that when Fairbairn had lost his wife and had his health starting to decline, he became less and less available, less and less resistant, and that at some point he fell ill to pneumonia and almost died. And at that point he became too fragile, and Fairbairn did tell him that basically at that moment he became like Percy, dead in the eyes of Guntrip. And for Guntrip that was too much. He couldn't tolerate to lose another Percy, and he had to cut ties and cut his analysis with Fairbairn and stop it at a point where basically he was not going to lose Fairbairn. And Fairbairn was okay with that, and Fairbairn even recommended Winnicott. And so he went to see Winnicott a couple of years later, I think. And the idea was that Winnicott was much more warm, both in terms of his setting, meaning his setting was very warm. The office was much warmer than Fairbairn. Fairbairn was very aristocratic in the vibe. Winnicott, much more human, much more direct. And Winnicott often hand him a cup of tea and they would start talking. So much more human, much more warm. And Winnicott, on his side, was the mother in a way that Guntrip needed to be able to heal from certain elements. And with Winnicott, he worked out that whole aspect of, in a way, the death of Percy was not the wasn't the be-all and end-all of his trauma, that his mother was never really truly available, except at a very, very early in his development. And he also recants that basically after Percy's death, Guntrip went into, at 3.5 years old, a profound withdrawal, which is, when you know his fairies on schizoid development, you kind of make a parallel, basically, even though he doesn't make it. Let's be straight, I'm making it right now, but I find it interesting to intertwine those elements. Basically, he went into a withdrawal, or where he was himself, his health was declining, and the doctor that came and saw young Guntrip said that to his mother, "Oh, you love him, basically, and he will survive, but I'm not going to be able to save him if you don't care for him." And his mother, not being able to love him or to give him what he needed, sent him to his aunt, her sister. And basically, Guntrip found a new reason to live, a new people to live for, and that's how he states it: people to live for. His aunt, the love of his aunt, his uncle, and all of that allowed him to grow back into health, even though psychosomatic illnesses persevered during childhood and adulthood for Guntrip, and those were means of trying to establish a relationship. And so with Winnicott, even though he only saw him like twice a month, for practical reasons, the whole development, he kept notes, detailed notes. He took notes of every single session. I'm talking about Guntrip as a patient, of everything Winnicott said, everything Fairbairn said. So basically, he had a lot of data to work on. And basically, Winnicott was very surprised, very happily surprised, saying that, "Oh, well, I have never had a patient that could just tell me so exactly what I've just said, or what I said a couple of weeks ago." And basically, with Winnicott, it was a much more human, much more deeper connection to the core self of Guntrip, and really helped him heal. Unfortunately, Winnicott fell ill also, and basically they had a chat over the phone, and a couple of weeks later, Winnicott passed. And what Guntrip states is that basically at that point he had to continue moving forward alone. He was already an analyst dealing with patients, so he was not a young man by any stretch of the imagination, but basically one can feel that Guntrip was very attached to both Fairbairn and Winnicott, perhaps a lot. And basically I think that his analysis wisdom, if I may put in my interpretation, never really stopped, because basically he had insights even afterwards. I think he was able to build a long-lasting and loving relationship with the both of them. Relationship that allowed him to grow and develop even years, or even perhaps decades, after all the therapeutic work had been done. And he does say that, in a way, things never truly end, and that he matured, grew, even after the analysis with those two incredible analysts, that things were still left to be discovered. And I think that that's an important message, and a brilliant one, to all clinicians, that basically sometimes you can't go to the deep end, and you need to change analysts. Or two analysts can be complementary, both on their approach and on their dynamics and how they are, and that you shouldn't be afraid of basically changing when you feel the need to change. And I felt that was a brilliant statement, that different analysts can bring different perspectives and different ways of moving forward. And in the end, even though I think he died a couple of months after this article I think is incredibly important, and perhaps it's I feel a must read for anyone interested in psychotherapy. Not just psychoanalysis, but really psychotherapy, as I think that the fact that he's both a clinician and a patient shows the dual dynamic, and shows the importance of psychotherapy and how it can really change the life of someone for the better. Anyway, that's my take on the text. I hope you liked the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.